Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a city floating on water where moonlight rests on ripples instead of rooftops, and every whisper of the tide carries a secret from centuries ago. Imagine streets made of dreams, bridges made of marble and longing, and gondolas gliding like gentle thoughts in the mind of night. This is not a fantasy, but a memory of something real. A city born from fear, raised by courage, and shaped by the sea itself. Tonight, let us drift together into the story of Venice, the impossible city that refused to sink. Before we return to the waters of the lagoon, let us remember where we left our hearts in the quiet dusk of an ancient world, when empires trembled and hope seemed like a faint candle against the wind. The story now opens where fear met the sea, and from that meeting something miraculous was born. Long ago in the 5th century after Christ, the world of northern Italy was falling apart. The mighty Roman Empire, once a shining star over Europe, was crumbling like an old statue touched by time. From the east came the Huns, fierce, relentless riders, who left ashes wherever their horses passed. Cities that had stood for generations vanished in smoke. Families fled with whatever they could carry, their footsteps echoing across the broken roads of an empire that had forgotten how to protect its people. Among these wanderers were the Veneti, humble fishermen, salt workers, and farmers. They had no swords, no armies, only their will to survive. And so, in the middle of chaos, they looked toward the sea, to a strange and inhospitable place. A shallow lagoon filled with mud, salt, and restless water. It was a wilderness no soldier wished to cross, for the ground itself sank beneath one's feet. Yet that desolation, that endless shimmer of water and wind, offered what the world could no longer give safety. There, amid the marshes and the whisper of reeds, the first Venetians found refuge. They built small huts on tiny islands barely rising above the tide. Their children learned to balance between water and sky, and their prayers were carried away by the wind. The nights were cold, the days uncertain, but they were alive. And that in those times was a kind of victory. Building a home on water was madness to many. Yet necessity turned fear into invention. The Venetians discovered that if they drove long wooden piles deep into the mud, so deep that they reached the solid clay beneath, they could build upon them. Slowly, a forest of inverted trees grew beneath the waves, holding up their fragile shelters. Above it, life began to take shape: wooden walkways, small churches, and the laughter of children who had never known solid ground. They were quite literally building their world upside down, roots in the sea, branches in the air. Each day they worked with the rhythm of the tides. When storms came, they waited in silence, listening to the rain tap against their roofs of reeds. When calm returned, they gathered driftwood, traded salt, and learned the language of the water. It was not an easy life, but it was pure, a life without kings or conquerors, only neighbors bound by survival and the salt on their skin. Years turned into generations, and what began as scattered shelters grew into a community. The lagoon that had once been a prison of mud became their shield and their teacher. It taught them patience, balance, and the art of adapting, of bending without breaking. The sea tested them, but it also carried gifts: fish, wind, and distant whispers of trade from lands beyond the horizon. In those quiet dawns when the mist rose from the lagoon and the bells of the mainland were only faint echoes, something extraordinary was happening. A new people were being born, not Romans, not barbarians, but Venetians. Their roads would be canals. Their wagons would be boats. Their world would forever move to the rhythm of the tide. In the evenings, as the sky turned gold and the air filled with the scent of salt, the elders would tell the children stories not of warriors or conquests, but of survival, of cleverness, of learning to live where others saw only desolation. They told them that God had chosen this place of exile to teach them humility and endurance, that from mud could rise marble and from fear could come freedom. And so, little by little, the impossible city began to breathe. Its heartbeat was the water lapping at its edges, its soul the courage of those who refused to die. By the time other kingdoms rose and fell again, the settlement in the lagoon had already found its purpose, not to dominate, but to endure. When travelers approached by sea, they saw not a fortress, but a miracle buildings that seemed to float, their reflections shimmering like dreams. Venice, the city that should never have existed, had defied the laws of nature and the fate of men. Its people would carry that defiance in their blood forever. From the trembling hands that placed the first stakes in the mud would come shipbuilders, merchants, and philosophers who would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean. But for now, in this first night of its creation, the city simply slept a cradle of wood and water beneath the stars. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The faint creaking of the wooden piles beneath the waves, the whisper of the lagoon as it rocks the city gently to sleep. And as you rest tonight, perhaps you too can feel what they felt. That strange mixture of fear and hope, of danger and divine protection, when the world ends and begins again in water. So, let the waves carry you as they once carried them into the calm heart of the sea. If this story has drifted softly into your imagination, let it stay there. And if you'd like to wander through more gentle worlds like this one, I invite you to subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, where history whispers and every night finds its way home. The night that wrapped around Venice was quiet, the water glimmering softly beneath the starlight. The first houses, still standing on their forest of wooden piles, whispered like reeds in the wind. The people who had once fled in fear now lived in a fragile peace, and the city born from salt and mud was beginning to understand its own heartbeat. Out of the silence of survival came the next longing, not for food or safety, but for order. And so, from the scattered islands and flickering lamplight of early Venice, a new question arose. Who would guide them now? They had escaped kings and tyrants on the mainland. Their ancestors had bowed before the iron hands of emperors, only to lose everything when empires collapsed. Here, surrounded by water and wind, they wanted no crowns, no royal blood, no man who ruled by birth. They needed a leader, yes, but one who walked among them, not above them. The Venetians gathered to discuss their fate. Their voices carried over the canals, echoing between wooden walls. Out of that collective longing came an idea unlike any in Europe at the time, a republic, where the people, those who built ships, traded salt, and fished beneath the stars, would decide together how to live. From this vision, they created a title both humble and wise. Doge derived from the Latin dux, meaning leader. Not a king, not an emperor, simply the first among equals. The first doges were chosen by the community's most respected men. They were expected to serve for life not as monarchs, but as guardians of the common good. Each doge wore robes of crimson not to declare power, but to symbolize the weight of duty. His palace was no fortress, but a hall open to the sound of water and the murmur of citizens passing outside. And though he was called the head of the republic, his steps were watched carefully, his decisions guided by counsels that kept him humble. This was the beginning of Venice's greatest genius, not in war or invention, but in balance. Where other nations swayed between tyranny and chaos, Venice built a system designed to endure. The Doge could not name his successor. His own sons were forbidden from holding office while he ruled. Every letter sent to him from foreign lands had to be opened and read by the state before he could see it. Even to leave the city, the Doge had to seek permission from his own council. In the city of water, power floated, but it never drowned the people beneath it. The great families of Venice merchants whose wealth came from trade formed the heart of this republic. They met in the Great Council, a vast assembly of noble names written into the city's memory. They elected smaller councils, and those councils watched over one another, weaving a web of responsibility that held the city together for nearly 1,000 years. It was not democracy as we know it now, but it was something purer than the monarchies that surrounded it. A carefully tuned harmony between ambition and restraint. To protect the state from the shadows of conspiracy, Venice created one of the most secretive institutions in history, the Council of 10. These 10 men, chosen for their loyalty and intellect, worked in silence, hidden behind veils of law and fear. Their duty was to protect Venice from treachery within and without. Around the city, stone mouths shaped like lions appeared in walls and palaces. They were called Bocche di Leon, the lion's mouths. Through these carved openings, citizens could drop anonymous notes accusing others of crimes against the Republic. Each whisper, each suspicion, fell into the ears of the Council of 10, who would decide the truth in secret. It was a republic built not only on trust, but on vigilance. And yet that vigilance became its strength. While kings fell and dynasties turned to dust, Venice remained unbroken. Its secret lay not in perfection, but in its awareness of human frailty. The Venetians knew that power corrupts, so they surrounded it with mirrors. They knew that ambition blinds, so they forced every ruler to walk through corridors of reflection. In that way, the city became a living lesson in humility. A government built on mistrust, yet sustained by wisdom. Each dawn, as the Doge stepped out onto his balcony to face the rising sun over the lagoon, he saw not subjects, but citizens. Below him, fishermen untied their boats, merchants loaded goods, and gondoliers called across the water. The air was alive with work, not fear. In the distance, the bells of 100 churches began to sing their echoes, mingling with the cry of seabirds. It was as if the city itself breathed in rhythm with its people. The Doge's palace stood beside the great Basilica of St. Mark, a pairing of faith and law, soul and reason. Together, they framed the heart of the Republic. The palace, with its lace-like arches of marble and pink stone, seemed to float like a dream upon the canal. The basilica, with its domes of gold mosaic, reflected the light of Byzantium and the hope of a city that looked both east and west. Here, politics and spirituality did not compete. They coexisted, shimmering together in the reflection of the sea. The Venetians had achieved what few civilizations ever could. They had turned fear into order, chaos into art. The republic they built would outlast empires, crusades, and even plagues. It would govern itself with a grace that confounded its enemies and inspired its allies. For centuries, visitors from faraway lands would marvel at this strange city, where no king ruled and no revolution tore it apart. They called it La Serenissima, the most serene republic. As twilight fell and the lanterns were lit along the Grand Canal, the Doge would retreat to his chamber and dip his pen in ink, signing decrees that kept the fragile harmony alive. Outside, the city's waters lapped softly against the stone. Venice, the daughter of the sea, had learned how to govern herself as she had learned to float, always moving, never sinking. The bells marked the end of another day. In the distance, a gondolier's song drifted over the lagoon, slow, haunting, and full of longing. The sound wound through the narrow canals and faded into the night, as if the city itself were humming in its sleep, content to know that power for now was in balance. And so Venice rested again, suspended between moonlight and water, her reflection trembling but never breaking. In the coming years, she would learn to deal with greater powers still, the Empire of Byzantium and the call of the East. But for tonight, the city was serene. Her people united her, Doge vigilant yet human, her destiny quietly unfolding like the tide. If you can still hear the gentle echo of the bells, let it guide you into calmness. Let the stillness of this ancient city remind you that even in uncertain waters, balance can be found. And as your eyes grow heavy, remember, in Venice, even fear learned to rest. If you felt the calm rhythm of the lagoon tonight, let it stay with you. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, and together we'll drift into the next chapter, where the golden mosaics of Byzantium cast their light upon the water, and the dream of Venice begins to shine. The night had ended, with the soft echo of bells and the reflection of a crimson robe upon the water. The Doge, the leader who was not a king, had guided his people toward a new kind of peace, one built not upon conquest, but on balance and restraint. Now, as the mist of dawn rose once again over the lagoon, the people of Venice looked beyond their watery home. The sea, which had once been their refuge, began whispering of distant horizons, of gold mosaics and empires that shimmered beneath another sun. It was the East calling the ancient and splendid world of Byzantium. At that time, Constantinople was the crown of the Christian world, a city so vast and magnificent that it seemed touched by heaven itself. Its domes glowed with mosaics of saints, its palaces shimmered with silk from Persia and spices from India. It was here that the spirit of the Roman Empire still lived, reborn in marble and faith. Venice, though small and young, found itself tied to this mighty realm. Officially, it was a province, a humble duchy under the protection of the Byzantine emperor. But the Venetians, clever and self-reliant, as the tides knew how to turn even servitude into opportunity. They traded with the Byzantines, supplied their fleets, and learned their arts. In return, they gained what no other Western city could access to the richest markets on earth. Silk, glass, perfumes, and gems flowed through Venetian hands, turning their wooden piers into bridges of gold. Yet the connection ran deeper than commerce. The Venetians adopted the Byzantine love for splendor and ceremony. They borrowed its architecture, its music, its sacred imagery. Soon their small lagoon city began to gleam with the same golden light that filled the churches of the East. At the heart of Venice rose the Basilica of St. Mark. Its domes, inspired by Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, seemed to float like lanterns in the fog. Inside the walls shimmered with mosaics of gold and sapphire blue. Angels, prophets, and saints glowed in eternal light, their faces serene and timeless. Each tile was a whisper from Byzantium, each shimmer a promise of divine beauty. For the Venetians, these mosaics were not mere art. They were a mirror of their identity. They were a Western people dreaming in Eastern light. And yet, even as they honored the empire that had once protected them, they were quietly learning to walk alone. Venice's merchants and sailors were growing wealthy. Their ships carried goods from Alexandria, Antioch, and Crete. They served as intermediaries between worlds, between Christendom and Islam, East and West. Their wealth, born from the sea, gave them independence. And with independence came ambition. The Byzantine emperors were powerful, but their empire was aging. Its borders strained under the pressure of new enemies, the Normans from the west, the Seljuks from the east. Whenever trouble came, the emperor called upon Venice. The Republic's navy, swift and disciplined, became his shield. The Venetians fought for the empire, but they never did so for free. Each victory brought them new privileges, trading rights, tax exemptions, and entire quarters of foreign cities under their control. In the year 1082, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, desperate for aid, granted Venice one of the greatest privileges in history. By imperial decree, the famous Golden Bull Venetian merchants were allowed to trade throughout the Byzantine realm without paying taxes. They even received their own district and docks in Constantinople itself. It was a triumph that would make Venice rich beyond measure, but it would also sow the seeds of jealousy. The Venetians flooded into the imperial capital. They built warehouses and churches along the Golden Horn, their banners fluttering beside those of the emperor. To the citizens of Constantinople, they were both admired and despised. These seafaring men from the lagoons grew arrogant, flaunting their wealth, speaking with the easy confidence of those who had never known defeat. Markets once filled with Greek traders now spoke Italian. Gold that should have enriched the empire flowed instead into Venetian coffers. Bitterness simmered like a storm on the horizon. Over time, the alliance between Venice and Byzantium, once a marriage of necessity, turned into a strained and uneasy friendship. The empire, weakened by its own intrigues, began to resent the power of its Western allies. Riots broke out in Constantinople, and more than once, the Venetian quarter was burned. But the Venetians had long memories. Beneath their polite diplomacy, they kept count of every insult, every betrayal. They had served the empire faithfully for generations, and now they began to see themselves not as servants, but as rivals. In the narrow canals of Venice, whispers spread among the merchants. The Byzantine Empire, once a pillar of the Christian world, was crumbling, and in its shadow, a new kind of empire was rising, not one of land and crowns, but of ships, ports, and trade. Venice had begun to dream not of serving an emperor, but of becoming its own. The city's artists still decorated their churches with golden mosaics. But those mosaics began to tell a new story. Where once they had reflected the grandeur of Byzantium, they now reflected the growing confidence of the Republic. The sea had taught the Venetians to depend on no one, not even on those who had given them life. And just as the tide retreats from the shore that once embraced it, so too did Venice begin to drift away from the empire that had shaped it. By the end of the 12th century, the bond was broken. The servant had outgrown the master. Venice now stood proudly as an independent power, its sails unfurled to every horizon. But deep beneath the calm waters of its success lay a current of danger, a memory of humiliation, and desire for revenge. The Venetians had learned the secrets of Constantinople's wealth, and they had seen its weaknesses. Someday they would return, not as allies, but as conquerors. For now the city basked in the reflected glow of two worlds. The golden mosaics of the east still gleamed in St. Mark's Basilica, but outside the sound of hammers echoed through the arsenal. Ships were being built faster, stronger, more numerous than ever. Venice was preparing for something greater, though few could yet see what storm was gathering on the horizon. As the sun set, the domes of the basilica burned with golden fire, and their reflection trembled in the water. The city seemed caught between heaven and sea, faith and ambition, gratitude and rebellion. The soft wind carried the mingled scent of incense and salt, of devotion and trade. Venice was no longer a refuge. It was becoming a force, a bridge between worlds, and soon a power that would shake them both. And as night returned over the lagoon, the golden light of Byzantium lingered on the water, like a memory that refused to fade. If the quiet shimmer of Venice has kept your heart awake, stay close. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, and let the next tale carry you further into the sacred theft of a saint, and the moment when Venice claimed heaven itself as her crown. The light of Byzantium still shimmered faintly across the water, as dawn broke over Venice. The golden mosaics inside St. Mark's Basilica glowed like captured sunlight, but beneath their beauty, a quiet unease was stirring. The Venetians had learned much from the Empire of the East, its art, its splendor, its mastery of trade. But they had also inherited a longing of their own, the desire for a sacred identity. The time had come for Venice to have not only her own ruler and her own power, but also her own saint. The heart of the city needed a heartbeat from heaven. From their beginning as refugees in the lagoon, the Venetians had always believed that Providence had chosen them. Yet for all their growing wealth and their political independence, their spiritual foundation still belonged to another world. Their patron saint was a minor Byzantine figure, a symbol of their past subordination to Constantinople. Venice could no longer accept being a spiritual province of someone else's empire. The Republic, now confident and self-sufficient, needed a protector worthy of its destiny. They dreamed not of a new saint, but of one whose name already carried the weight of the Gospels, St. Mark the Evangelist. But St. Mark was not in Venice. His sacred relics, his body rested far away in the great city of Alexandria in Egypt, guarded by priests and protected by the Muslim rulers of the land. To bring him to Venice was to attempt the impossible. It meant crossing boundaries of faith, law, and danger. Yet what seemed impossible to the rest of the world was merely a challenge to Venetian cunning. In the year 828, two Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, set sail for Alexandria. Officially, they came to trade. Secretly, they carried a mission of divine theft. Their goal was to rescue, or rather to steal, the body of Saint Mark and bring it home. The story that would follow would be told and retold for centuries, until it became the very soul of Venice itself. The two merchants reached Alexandria under the pretense of commerce. There they visited the shrine of Saint Mark, a place where candles burned day and night, and the air was thick with incense and devotion. They befriended the guardians of the tomb, who were troubled men. Rumors had begun to spread that the Muslim authorities might soon desecrate or remove Christian relics from the land. Playing upon this fear, the Venetians presented themselves as saviors rather than thieves. They whispered that St. Mark's relics would be safer in the faraway city of Venice, a Christian city surrounded by water, protected by the sea and by faith. Through a mixture of persuasion, bribery, and daring, they convinced the keepers to help them. By night, they broke open the marble sarcophagus and lifted the body of the evangelist, wrapping it carefully in linen. Yet their greatest test was still ahead: how to pass through the city's busy port, where every ship was searched before departure. The risk was immense. Discovery would mean execution. Here, the merchants' ingenuity met its finest hour. They placed the relics of Saint Mark into a large wicker basket and concealed them beneath layers of pork and cabbage leaves. When the Muslim inspectors approached, they hesitated. The smell alone was offensive to them. Pork was forbidden in their faith. Disgusted, they waved the basket through without inspection. And so, under the disguise of unclean meat, the body of one of Christianity's greatest saints sailed quietly away from Egypt. When the ship arrived in Venice, the entire city erupted in celebration. Bells rang from every church tower. The Doge himself came to the harbor to greet the returning sailors. The body of Saint Mark was carried through the streets in a grand procession. Candles flickered, banners waved, and tears shone in the eyes of the people. For them, this was not theft, but salvation, a sacred act of courage that sealed their destiny. From that day forward, Venice was no longer just a trading republic. It was a city chosen by heaven. The relic was placed in a temporary chapel, and the Doge immediately commissioned the construction of a magnificent new basilica, a fitting resting place for the evangelist. Over the next decades, the Basilica di San Marco rose like a vision from the lagoon, its domes gleaming with gold mosaics, its walls covered in marble brought from the far corners of the world. Inside, beneath the light of hundreds of oil lamps, the remains of Saint Mark rested in honor, the patron and protector of the Venetian state. But it was not only a relic that had arrived, it was a symbol. The Venetian Republic had found its soul, and with it a new emblem of divine authority. The traditional icon of Saint Mark was a winged lion, often depicted holding a book inscribed with the words Pax tibi, Marche, Evangelista meus, peace be upon you, Mark my evangelist. From that moment, the lion became the living spirit of Venice. It appeared on coins, fluttered on the sails of warships, and guarded every city gate the Venetians built across their growing empire. The lion's gaze, fierce yet calm, seemed to embody everything Venice aspired to be: proud, watchful, and eternal. Across Europe, people whispered of the theft of the saint. Some called it blasphemy, others a miracle. But to the Venetians, it was destiny. Their republic had now been sanctified not by the blessing of an emperor, but by the bones of an apostle. The lagoon had been a place of refuge. Now it had become a shrine. The city of merchants had turned itself into a holy city of the sea. Over the centuries, artists would paint and carve the story of the saint's arrival again and again. In glittering mosaics above the basilica's doors, one can still see the merchants lifting the relic from its basket. The astonished priests of Alexandria looking on. The gold tiles shimmer as the sunlight moves across them, as if the very sea itself were telling the tale anew each day. For the Venetians, Saint Mark was more than a symbol of faith. He was the guardian of their destiny. His lion watched over every ship that left the lagoon. His name was invoked in every victory his presence felt, in every storm that broke over the Adriatic. To be Venetian was to belong to Saint Mark, and to believe that heaven itself had chosen their city to stand forever between east and west, between sea and sky. That day, as the people knelt before the new relic, the Doge raised his hands and declared Venice the city of Saint Mark. The cheers of the crowd mingled with the sound of waves striking the docks. The sea, their old protector, seemed to approve, and when the night fell, the lagoon shimmered as if touched by invisible gold, the reflection of faith itself. Venice had stolen a saint, yes, but perhaps in that daring act, the saint had also stolen their hearts. The lagoon city, once born from fear, was now baptized in glory. The Republic had its symbol, its faith, and its divine protector. And from this union of heaven and water, Venice would sail toward its greatest age, the age of ships of war and of empire. The golden lion of Saint Mark now watched over the city, its wings spread across banners and marble gates. Venice had found her soul in the relic of a saint, her divine protector resting within the basilica's jeweled walls. But even a sacred heart needs muscle to defend it. The same sea that blessed the city also threatened it. Across the Mediterranean, rivals and pirates lurked in restless waters. And so, while prayers rose inside St. Mark's Basilica, the steady rhythm of hammers began to echo through the eastern quarter of the city. Faith had given Venice her spirit, now she would forge her strength. Hidden behind tall red brick walls and guarded towers, the arsenal came to life. It was not merely a shipyard, it was the beating industrial heart of the Republic. Here the air was thick with the scent of pine tar, burning pitch and salt. The clatter of chisels, the ringing of metal, and the deep hum of saws blended into a single sound, the song of creation. Workers moved like a tide within its walls, thousands of them known as the arsenalotti. They were the craftsmen of the seamen whose hands could turn trees into ships and silence into thunder. In a world that still built by hand, the Venetians had conceived something astonishing, the first true assembly line in history. The arsenal was a vast machine of human precision, divided into workshops that specialized in every imaginable craft. In one hall, carpenters shaped long oars. In another, rope makers twisted endless coils of hemp. Blacksmiths cast anchors while others forged the intricate hinges and bolts that would hold entire ships together. Each man knew his task, each movement timed like a note in a grand composition. The genius of the arsenal was not just its organization, it was its speed. In other lands, a single galley might take months or years to build. In Venice, ships were produced as if by magic. Components were standardized and stored in massive warehouses. Masts, sails, rudders and oars were all prepared in advance, stacked and labeled, waiting for their turn in the process. Along a long, straight canal that cut through the complex, half-finished hulls, were towed from one station to the next. At each stop, a different team swarmed the vessel, fitting it with what their craft had prepared. The rhythm was relentless, the coordination astonishing. It was said that a foreign dignitary visiting the arsenal once witnessed a galley being assembled, equipped and armed in the time it took him to dine. Whether myth or truth, the idea itself spoke of Venice's genius. The Republic had transformed shipbuilding into an art of discipline and unity. The arsenal was not simply a workshop, it was the soul of Venice made visible, practical, secretive, and endlessly inventive. To protect the state's supremacy, every detail of the arsenal's work was guarded with the same care as the relics of St. Mark. The arsenalati were sworn to secrecy, bound to their labor for life. They were paid well housed by the state and given privileges unknown to ordinary workers. In return, they owed Venice absolute loyalty. To betray a secret was to betray the city itself. And so the arsenal became a fortress not only against enemies abroad, but against curiosity at home. Few outsiders were ever allowed within its gates. Those who entered often spoke in hushed awe afterward, describing it as a city within a city pulsing with order and purpose. The ships born from those walls were more than tools of war. Each one carried the breath of the Republic. Sleek and narrow with high, curved prows, the Venetian galleys seemed to glide rather than cut through the water. Their oars, long and symmetrical, moved in perfect rhythm, as if the sea itself had learned obedience. Some ships were built for commerce, sturdy cargo vessels that crossed the Mediterranean loaded with spices and silk. Others were designed for war, swift, lethal, and adorned with the lion of St. Mark upon their sails. Each time a new ship slid from the arsenal's canal into the lagoon, the people gathered to watch. They cheered as the hull kissed the water, as if welcoming a newborn child into the world. From the arsenal came the fleets that protected Venetian trade routes, fought pirates, and carried crusaders to distant shores. It was here that Venice's destiny as a maritime power was sealed. The Republic's leaders understood that whoever ruled the sea ruled the world of trade, and whoever controlled trade controlled the destiny of nations. The arsenal made that dream possible. It gave Venice a weapon no enemy could match: the ability to build faster, sail farther, and strike sooner than any rival. Yet there was poetry in its precision. The workers, though bound to strict discipline, sang as they worked. The sound of their voices floated through the air, mingling with the clang of hammers and the soft wash of the tide against the walls. It was a human symphony, one of sweat and devotion, of craft and pride. Some said that the arsenal was like a living organism, breathing through its gates, exhaling power and inhaling purpose. Within those walls, the Republic was constantly reborn, ship by ship, beam by beam. At sunset, when the day's work ended, the sea beyond the arsenal shimmered with the silhouettes of ships newly launched. Their sails caught the fading light, glowing amber and crimson like wings. The workers, exhausted but proud, would watch them drift toward the horizon. Each vessel was a promise, a piece of Venice herself, sent out into the world. And in their hearts they believed that the sea, like a mother, would always guide her children home. The arsenal also shaped Venice's spirit. It taught her citizens the virtue of discipline and the necessity of secrecy. It reminded them that even beauty must be built on strength, for behind every marble palace and golden mosaic stood the unseen labor of men who worked by torchlight, their hands roughened by salt and flame. The arsenal was both their cathedral and their crucible. Within its walls, wood, fire, and human will fused into a single act of creation, a testament to what unity could achieve. By the time night fell and the lagoon lay still, the sound of the arsenal's hammers had faded. Only the soft lapping of waves remained, like the city's own slow heartbeat. From the Doge's palace to the humblest dock, Venice rested under the watchful eyes of St. Mark's Lion. The city had found balance between faith and force, between the sacred and the practical. And as the stars rose over the quiet lagoon, it seemed that even the heavens paused to listen to the silence of a city preparing once again to shape the course of history. In the days to come, Venice would turn that power into ritual. Her bond with the sea, once born of survival, would be renewed each year in splendor and devotion. The Doge himself would ride upon the waters to declare the city's eternal marriage to the sea, a promise that Venice, and the water that carried her, would never be apart. But for now, as the last echoes of hammer and song faded into night, the arsenal slept its dreams filled with ships yet unbuilt, waiting for dawn and destiny. Night lingered gently over Venice, the lagoon calm and breathing after a long day of labor. The rhythmic pulse of hammers within the arsenal had fallen silent, leaving only the whisper of waves brushing against the docked ships. From the chimneys of the shipyard rose a faint veil of smoke, carrying the scent of resin and pine into the air. The city slept peacefully beneath its canopy of stars. Yet even in its rest, Venice was listening to the water, to the tide, to the promise that had bound her to the sea since her birth. For it was not merely the arsenal's strength that kept her alive. It was a deeper covenant, a marriage older than memory itself. Each year as spring returned, and the morning air grew warm, Venice renewed that sacred bond. The ceremony was called La Senza, the marriage of the sea. It was the most beloved and dazzling ritual of the Republic. Part prayer, part declaration, part pageantry beyond compare. Through this ceremony, Venice did what no other city in the world had ever dared to do. She made the sea her eternal spouse. The day began long before sunrise. The canals awoke in hushed excitement. Bells rang across the lagoon, echoing over the rooftops and stirring the gulls from their sleep. The city's people, merchants, artisans, nobles, and sailors lined the waterfront, their voices murmuring like a tide of anticipation. The Doge, dressed in his crimson robes of state, stepped from the marble arches of the palace. His face was calm, solemn, radiant in the morning light. Around him stood ambassadors from distant lands, priests in white vestments, and guards in gilded armor. Yet the true grandeur of the moment waited upon the water. Moored beside the Doge's palace was the Bucintoro, the state barge of Venice. It was not merely a ship, it was a floating palace of gold and scarlet. Its sides were carved with angels and lions, its deck lined with silken banners that fluttered like the wings of celestial birds. Every plank gleamed as if kissed by sunlight. Musicians stood along its railings holding lutes and trumpets that shimmered in the glow. When the Doge stepped aboard, the crowd erupted into cheers. The oarsmen, strong and steady, dipped their blades into the lagoon, and the Bucentoro began to glide across the water with a majesty that seemed almost divine. Hundreds of smaller boats followed, decorated with flowers and colored cloth. Families waved from balconies, tossing petals into the air. The smell of salt and incense mingled, and the songs of sailors drifted from gondolas painted for the feast. The entire city moved together as if the canals themselves were veins carrying life through Venice's heart. The procession sailed toward the Lido, the narrow strip of land where the calm waters of the lagoon met the open Adriatic Sea. It was here, at this threshold between safety and mystery, that the sacred ritual would take place. The sea waited patiently, its waves curling like the folds of a great blue gown. The people said the sea was alive, that she could hear and feel and remember. For centuries, she had protected Venice, feeding her with trade, guarding her with storms, and carrying her ships to distant worlds. And now, once again, she awaited her husband. When the Bucentoro reached the mouth of the lagoon, the music ceased. The only sounds were the wind and the gentle rocking of the water. The Doge rose from his throne, holding a golden ring in his hand. It was simple, yet heavy with meaning, a symbol not of wealth, but of eternal union. The priests beside him offered prayers in Latin, their voices blending with the sigh of the breeze. Then, in a voice clear and measured, the Doge spoke the ancient vow, Desponsamus te mare, in signum veri perpetuique Domini. We marry you, O sea, as a sign of true and everlasting dominion. With those words he threw the ring high into the air. It flashed once in the sunlight before sinking beneath the surface, swallowed by the blue. For a moment, silence held the world still. Then the crowd erupted into cheers. The bells of every church began to ring, and the musicians struck up a jubilant hymn. The sea, the city, and the people were one once more. The ceremony was more than tradition, it was the purest expression of who the Venetians were. They did not rule by sword or soil, but by sail and current. The sea was their mother, their shield, their endless road. By marrying it, they declared both their love and their dependence. They were promising not conquest, but communion. It was as though the Republic whispered, "We belong to you, and you to us. Let us rise and fall together until the end of time." For those who watched from the shore, the moment was holy. Old fishermen crossed themselves. Children waved to the golden ship disappearing into the horizon. Some said they could feel the sea respond, a shift in the wind, a sparkle on the surface, a sigh that sounded like approval. And when the Bucentoro turned back toward the city, the sunlight danced on the water like scattered jewels, as if heaven itself had blessed the marriage. The festival continued through the day. Markets overflowed with food, music filled the piazzas, and laughter echoed through every alley. The scent of roasted chestnuts, citrus, and wine drifted over the canals. But beneath the joy, there was reverence. The marriage of the sea was not mere spectacle, it was the soul of Venice laid bare. For all her wealth and power, she remained humble before the sea that had given her life. As dusk descended, the Bucentoro returned to the palace. The Doge stepped ashore, greeted by torchlight, and the murmuring of prayers. In the distance, the waves lapped softly against the stone embankments, each touch like a lover's caress. The golden ring was gone, but its promise lingered in every ripple. Venice had renewed her vow not only to the sea, but to herself, to endure, to balance faith and fortune, beauty and strength. That night, when the city finally slept, the lagoon shimmered with the quiet glow of moonlight. The reflection of St. Mark's domes wavered on the surface, and beneath it, unseen in the dark depths, lay the ring of gold. The people said the sea guarded it tenderly, holding it close in her hidden heart, waiting for the next year's vow. And so the city of water, once born from fear, now lived in harmony with its chosen bridegroom. The marriage of the sea was more than ritual. It was renewal, a reminder that power without reverence is as fragile as glass. In that delicate balance between command and surrender, Venice found her truest strength. The next dawn would bring new challenges, new tides, and new ambitions. Far beyond the horizon, the call of war and faith was rising again, a crusade that would test not just the power of Venice's ships, but the soul of the Republic itself. The sea had accepted its ring. The vow had been spoken once more, and the city wrapped in gold, and music had renewed its eternal bond. As the sound of celebration faded into the quiet of evening, Venice glowed like a lantern upon the water. Her ships rested in the harbor. Her people dreamed under the scent of salt and candle wax. And the waves whispered the same promise over and over: as long as you are faithful to me, I shall keep you safe. Yet across the horizon, darker winds were gathering. The sea that blessed Venice was also a road to war, and the next tide would carry her not toward peace, but into the heart of a crusade that would shake the Christian world. It was the dawn of the 13th century. The Pope Innocent III had declared a new holy mission, the Fourth Crusade. Europe stirred once again with the cry of Deus vult, God wills it, knights from France. And the Holy Roman Empire gathered their banners, armor, and dreams of salvation. They would sail to the Holy Land, conquer Jerusalem, and reclaim it from Muslim hands. But to do that, they needed ships, many ships, and there was only one city in all of Christendom capable of building such a fleet. That city was Venice. At the time, Venice was led by one of the most remarkable figures in her long history, Doge Enrico Dandolo. He was in his 90s, frail in body, but fierce in spirit. His eyes had long gone blind, but his mind saw farther than most men could dream. Under his guidance, the Republic had grown rich and unyielding, a power balanced between faith and ambition. When the envoys of the Crusaders came to his palace pleading for ships to carry their armies east, Dandolo listened not as a servant of Rome, but as the ruler of a maritime empire. He struck a deal that only Venice could make. The Republic would halt all its trade and dedicate the full might of its arsenal to building a massive fleet ships, enough to carry 33,000 men and nearly 5,000 horses across the sea. It was an undertaking so vast that no other nation could have matched it. In return, the Crusaders agreed to pay a staggering sum, 85,000 silver marks. For over a year, every hammer in the arsenal rang, every craftsman labored, every canal echoed with the building of ships meant for heaven's war. When summer came and the fleet was ready, the Crusaders began to arrive. But the army that stepped onto Venetian soil was far smaller than promised. Many lords and knights had failed to come, and those who did were burdened with debts and delays. They could not pay the agreed price. The fleet, magnificent, gleaming, ready for glory, sat idle in the lagoon, and the Republic stood on the edge of ruin. Venice had spent her treasury and halted her commerce. The city that never gambled now faced the risk of bankruptcy. It was in that desperate moment that the blind Doge revealed the cunning of a man who had built his life upon the shifting tides of fortune. He summoned the Crusader leaders and made them an offer. If they could not pay with silver, they would pay with service. Venice would carry them to war, but before they sailed for Jerusalem, they would help the Republic reclaim a rebel city that had defied Venetian authority. That city was Zara, a wealthy port along the Dalmatian coast, and a trading rival that had broken away. At first, the Crusaders protested. Zara was a Christian city. To attack it would be to raise sword against their own faith. The Pope had strictly forbidden such an act, warning that anyone who assaulted fellow Christians would be excommunicated. But the Crusaders were trapped, hungry, indebted, and stranded on an island that was not their home. Dandolo, blind yet unflinching, appealed to their logic and their pride. He promised them food, passage, and glory. He reminded them that without Venice, there would be no crusade at all. Finally, in a gesture that stunned the assembly, the Doge stood before them in St. Mark's Basilica. Though age had bent his frame, his voice filled the cathedral with unyielding strength. He declared that he himself would take the cross and lead the fleet. When he knelt before the altar, the crowd erupted. The Crusaders cheered, the Venetians wept, and the Pope's warnings were drowned by the roar of the sea. In that moment, Dandolo turned a holy war into a Venetian enterprise. In the autumn of 1202, the great fleet set sail. Hundreds of ships gleamed under the pale sky, their sails marked with the red cross of Christ and the golden lion of St. Mark. The oars struck the water in rhythm, a chorus of wood and wind. As they approached Zara, the city's defenders hung crucifixes and holy banners from their walls, pleading for mercy. They shouted to the Crusaders, reminding them that they were Christians too, but the order had been given, and the hunger of debt and survival silenced conscience. The siege was swift and brutal. The walls fell beneath the combined assault of Venetian ships and Crusader knights. When the city surrendered, it was sacked and burned. Its treasures carried away as payment. The Pope, upon hearing the news, was horrified. He excommunicated the entire army, including Venice itself. But Dandolo was unmoved. He knew that papal anger faded faster than profit. Venice had reclaimed her rival and secured her debt. Yet in his heart, he understood that something far greater was now in motion. During the winter that followed, as the fleet lay anchored among the ruins of Zara, a strange visitor arrived. He was a young man named Alexios Angelos, a prince of the fallen Byzantine Empire. His father had been overthrown and blinded by a usurper who now sat upon the throne of Constantinople. Alexios offered the Crusaders an extraordinary bargain. If they helped him reclaim his father's crown, he would pay them in full supply, them with provisions, and even unite the Eastern and Western churches under the Pope. To the Crusaders, the offer seemed a divine opportunity. To Dandolo, it was something more, a chance to turn the Republic's old master into its servant. Constantinople, the queen of cities, was the richest prize in the world. Its warehouses overflowed with gold, silk, and relics. Its churches were filled with treasures beyond imagination. And now the key to that city lay in the hands of a blind old man who saw not with his eyes, but with the cold, clear vision of ambition. As spring approached, the Doge made his decision. The fleet would not sail for Jerusalem. It would sail for Constantinople. The Holy War had become a Venetian crusade. And so, once again, the oars dipped into the sea. The ships turned eastward, and the horizon filled with banners and prayers that masked the scent of greed. The waves rose beneath them, carrying not only men and horses, but the weight of history itself. What had begun as a mission of faith was becoming a test of Venice's soul. A gamble unlike any other. And at its center stood Enrico Dandolo, the blind Doge, whose faith was not in divine revelation, but in the restless power of the sea. As night fell, the fleet's torches shimmered across the water like stars adrift. The Lion of St. Mark, painted on every sail, glowed faintly in the firelight. Ahead lay the greatest city on earth, and a destiny written not by saints or kings, but by the hands of men who believed they could turn the will of God into their own. The Venetian fleet cut through the Adriatic like a procession of living fire. Behind them lay the smoking ruins of Zara, and the echo of a promise, broken. Ahead lay the horizon, calm, vast, and waiting. The sea had always carried Venice toward fortune, but this time its surface shimmered with something darker. It was no longer a voyage of faith or trade. It was a march toward temptation itself. For at the end of their journey stood Constantinople, the queen of cities, and her golden crown was about to be claimed by the hand of the sea-born republic. Spring of 1203 brought clear skies and restless hearts. The Crusader army, burdened with guilt and uncertainty, followed the will of the blind Doge, Enrico Dandolo, who stood at the prow of his ship, face turned toward the wind. Though his eyes saw nothing, his mind saw everything. The towers of Constantinople rising over the Bosporus, the gilded domes of its churches gleaming like suns upon the water. He had fought for the Byzantine emperors once, years ago, when Venice had been their servant. Now he returned not as ally, but as master. When the vast fleet appeared before the city's massive walls, the people of Constantinople could scarcely believe what they saw. The horizon was filled with sails white as bone, and at their center flew the crimson banners of Venice. Trumpets called across the sea. Bells tolled from every church tower in alarm. It was as if an entire floating kingdom had appeared from nowhere. The citizens crowded the battlements, peering down at the strange army that came bearing both the cross and the Lion of St. Mark. The Crusaders and Venetians had come as they claimed to restore the rightful heir, young Alexios Angelos, to his father's throne. Their cause was wrapped in the language of justice and faith, but beneath the silk of those words beat the steady, hungry rhythm of Venice's ambition. The Doge knew that if the prince succeeded, the reward would not merely be gold, but something greater: control over the richest trade city in the world. The first assault came swiftly. The Crusaders attacked from the land, while Venetian ships fitted with siege towers and scaling ladders advanced from the sea. It was a sight no one in Christendom had ever witnessed: war galleys turned into floating fortresses, their decks bristling with archers, their hulls slamming against the mighty walls. The blind doge, standing beneath a banner of crimson silk, ordered the assault himself. His voice, calm and resolute, carried across the chaos. By dusk, the defenders faltered. The usurper emperor fled, and the young Prince Alexios was crowned co-emperor of Byzantium amid the cheers of the Crusaders. For a brief moment, it seemed the gamble had succeeded. Dandolo entered the city not as conqueror, but as guest, his ships moored along the Golden Horn. The Venetians filled the markets and ports, their merchants setting up stalls, as if they had always belonged there. Gold and spices, silks and relics, all flowed again this time through Venetian hands. But glory has a short memory. Within months, the new emperor found himself drowning in promises he could not keep. He had pledged to pay vast sums to Venice and the Crusaders, but the imperial treasury was nearly empty. Taxes rose, resentment spread, and whispers of rebellion stirred through the streets. To the people of Constantinople, the Latin soldiers were no longer liberators. They were invaders. Fights broke out between locals and foreigners. Mobs attacked Venetian quarters, setting fire to warehouses and killing merchants in the streets. The air grew thick with smoke and fear. The city that had once been a beacon of faith and wealth became a furnace of anger. The emperor begged the Crusaders for patience, but Dandolo's patience was measured in silver, not mercy. When riots reached the harbor and Venetian ships were burned, he knew the alliance was finished. Then came the final betrayal. The young emperor, unable to control his people, was overthrown and murdered by his own subjects. The throne was taken by another ruler who spat on the Latin cross and vowed vengeance against the West. When the news reached the Crusader camp, fury replaced fatigue. They had been promised wealth, honor, and divine favor. Now they had only debt and humiliation. The blind doge saw what others could not. The moment had come. He gathered the Crusader leaders and spoke with the calm of a man who had already seen the outcome. "If we cannot have payment," he said, "then we shall take it ourselves." The decision was made. The fleet turned its prows toward the city once more. The cross and the lion of St. Mark flew side by side, not as symbols of piety, but of conquest. On an April morning in 1204, the attack began. The sea was alive with movement. Venetian galleys forming a line, their decks bristling with soldiers and priests, chanting blessings over the water. Arrows darkened the sky. The ships rammed the sea walls, and from their masts hung bridges that dropped like jaws onto the ramparts. The Venetians were the first to breach the defenses. Blind though he was, Dandolo himself was carried ashore at the front of his men. His courage became legend that day. What followed was 3 days of chaos and sorrow that history would never forget. Constantinople, the greatest city of the Christian world, fell not to its Muslim foes, but to fellow Christians. Its palaces were stripped bare, its libraries burned, its churches desecrated. Priceless relics, chalices, icons, and crosses were torn from their altars and shipped west. The 4 bronze horses that once stood at the Hippodrome were carried away to Venice, where they would crown the facade of St. Mark's Basilica for centuries to come. The Crusaders took the land, carving up the empire like a feast. But Venice took the sea. In the division of spoils, the Republic claimed 3/8 of Constantinople itself, along with a chain of islands and ports stretching from the Aegean to the Black Sea. The dream of Venice had been realized, She now ruled not only her lagoon, but an empire of water. And yet beneath the triumph there was unease. The Venetians had gained riches beyond imagining, but at what cost? The Christian world was horrified. Rome wept. The Pope denounced the sack, but Venice had already grown deaf to his anger. The blind Doge, standing at the window of his quarters in Constantinople, felt the breeze from the Bosporus on his face. He could not see the city's broken towers, but he could hear the hum of trade returning, the clink of coins, the low chant of sailors loading cargo. To him, that sound was victory. When Enrico Dandolo died a few years later, he was buried in the very city he had conquered, inside the great Hagia Sophia itself. His tombstone bore the name of a man who had once been a servant of the empire and died its master. The marble has long since vanished, destroyed, when the Ottomans later took the city. But his spirit remains in every Venetian ship that sails east. Every lion of St. Mark carved into foreign stone. The conquest of Constantinople marked the height of Venetian ambition. From the spoils of that victory, the Republic would build her empire of ports and islands, each one a glittering link in her maritime chain. But with the gold came shadows, rivalries, envy, and the heavy burden of a stolen crown. As the sun set over the shattered city, the waters of the Golden Horn shimmered with the reflection of fire and faith. Venice had conquered the queen of cities, but the sea, ever patient, whispered its warning. Every crown won upon the water must one day return to it. The smoke from Constantinople's burning palaces still hung over the sea long after the fleet had sailed away. The air smelled of incense and ash, of victory and remorse. Venice had achieved what no other city in the world had dared to dream. She had conquered the Queen of Empires, and her lion now cast its shadow across the waters of the East. But conquest was not the Venetian way. The Republic did not hunger for land or crowns. Her ambition was subtler and more enduring. She sought to rule the waves themselves. And so, from the ashes of Byzantium, Venice began to build something entirely new. An empire of the sea, an empire unlike any that had come before. When the spoils of war were divided among the Crusaders, the French knights demanded kingdoms and castles, pieces of earth to rule and defend. Venice, however, chose differently. She claimed no mountain or city inland, no golden throne. Instead, she took the harbors, the islands, the trade routes, the lifeblood of the Mediterranean. She understood that the world's wealth did not lie in soil, but in salt water, in the ceaseless movement of ships carrying silk, spice, and gold. It was an empire of ports, fortresses, and safe havens, stretching like a necklace of pearls from the lagoon to the farthest shores of the Black Sea. The Venetians called it Stato da Mar, the state of the sea. Each link in this maritime chain served a purpose: a harbor to anchor a fortress, to protect an island, to resupply. Together, they formed a highway of power. From every corner of this floating empire came wealth: grain from the Aegean, timber from Dalmatia, honey from Crete, and silk from the east. Venetian ships carried it all, returning home, with their holds filled, and their flags rippling proudly above the water. The Republic's first great jewel was the island of Crete, known to them as the Kingdom of Candia. Situated at the heart of the eastern Mediterranean, it became the cornerstone of Venice's dominion. From Crete, Her fleets could watch the sea lanes control trade between Egypt and Greece, and send swift warships to any coast in need of defense. To secure the island, Venice built fortresses whose walls still stand today, mighty bastions of stone rising straight from the surf, their towers crowned with the winged lion of St. Mark. Farther north along the Dalmatian coast, Venice fortified the ports of Zara Spalato and Ragusa, ensuring that no rival could threaten her supply lines. To the east, she claimed the Cyclades and the ports of the Peloponnese, their harbors glowing at dusk with the crimson of Venetian sails. Even in the ruins of Constantinople itself, Venice took her share. Entire districts of the city docks and warehouses quarters where her merchants lived under their own laws, surrounded by goods that flowed like rivers of treasure. The genius of the Venetian Empire lay in its design. It was not built for glory, but for endurance. Where others sought to dominate people, Venice sought to control the paths they traveled. Her governors ruled with pragmatism rather than cruelty. They collected taxes, maintained order, and kept the trade routes safe. The local populations, Greeks, Slavs, and islanders, often continued their daily lives unchanged, save that now their markets were filled with Venetian goods, their ports guarded by Venetian ships. The Republic's touch was light, yet everywhere. In each colony, a Venetian nobleman served as the governor, known as the Rhetor. He lived in a fortified palace that overlooked the harbor, a miniature reflection of the Doge's own palace back home. Around him gathered the symbols of Venetian authority, the flag bearing the lion, the seal of St. Mark, and the constant sound of bells ringing from the small churches the Venetians built wherever they went. Yet despite their outward piety, the true sanctuaries of this empire were its docks. Their sailors spoke a dozen languages. Merchants argued over prices, and the scent of tar, olive oil, and seaweed filled the air. It was a living testament to Venice's belief that commerce, not conquest, was the path to immortality. The sea became the Republic's frontier, its highways patrolled by sleek war galleys. The Venetians learned to read its moods as others read the stars. They knew the hidden reefs, the seasonal winds, the patterns of the tides. Their ships could appear anywhere, swift and silent, bringing both profit and judgment. Pirates, once the plague of the Mediterranean, soon learned to fear the red and gold banners that shimmered on the horizon. The Venetian navy, born in the arsenal, was everywhere at once, merciless in battle, disciplined in peace. In Venice itself, the arrival of ships from the colonies turned the city into a living market of the world. The quays of the Rialto overflowed with goods. Amphorae of wine from Greece, sacks of sugar from Crete, silks from Constantinople, spices from Syria. The air was thick with the mingled languages of sailors, the cries of traders, the clatter of hooves on stone. The Republic grew richer by the day, her palaces rising higher, her art growing more divine. And yet, through all this splendor, the city never forgot that its strength was borrowed from the sea and from the invisible network of islands that sustained her. There was a strange kind of poetry in the way the Venetians ruled their empire. They did not conquer in anger, nor did they destroy what they touched. Instead, they built connections, bridges across cultures, tides of trade that carried not just goods, but ideas. Through Venice, the knowledge of the East flowed into the West. Mathematics from the Arabs, silk from China, glasswork. and philosophy from Byzantium. In her ports, Christianity and Islam, Greek and Latin mingled without war. The sea, indifferent yet generous, became their common language. But this balance came at a price. The empire's wealth drew envy from rivals like Genoa and Pisa. Beyond the horizon, storms were forming both in the hearts of men and in the politics of nations. The very success that made Venice great would soon make her a target. For now, though, the Republic stood serene. Her ships ruled the waves, her merchants ruled the markets, and her people, lulled by the eternal rhythm of the tide, believed that the Lion of St. Mark would never fall. At night, from the highest towers of the Doge's palace, one could look eastward and imagine the endless chain of lights marking the Republic's dominion, tiny flames glowing on distant islands, each one a beacon of Venetian power. It was a kingdom without borders, built not on the soil of the earth, but on the shifting, glittering face of the sea. In those years of prosperity, a single name began to echo through the city's streets, and along its harbors, a name that would carry Venice's fame farther than any fleet could sail. It was the name of a young merchant's son who would journey beyond the known world and return with stories that would outshine even the gold of the Republic. His name was Marco Polo. The sea empire of Venice stretched farther than the eye could imagine, from Crete to Cyprus, from the Dalmatian coast to the edges of the Black Sea. The Lion of St. Mark guarded the harbors of a world connected by trade and trust. In every port, the scent of spice salt and smoke hung in the air, and gold glimmered in every exchange. Yet even in her greatest triumph, the Republic remained restless. Her people were born of the tide. Movement was their destiny. It was only natural that from this city of wanderers would rise a man who dared to follow the sea's whisper farther than any Venetian had ever dreamed, to the very ends of the earth. His name was Marco Polo. He was born in 1254 into a family of merchants whose lives were woven with the threads of distant lands. His father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo were men of ambition, Venetians, who believed that fortune belonged to those who sought it. Long before Marco could walk the streets of his glittering home, they had sailed eastward, following the routes of silk and spice beyond the reach of maps. Their ships carried them across the Mediterranean, up the Black Sea, and over the deserts of Persia. When they finally returned years later, their stories were like dreams made of dust and gold. They spoke of a world beyond imagination, a world of emperors and endless horizons, where the earth itself seemed to shimmer. And so, when Marco turned 17, he followed their call. In the year 1271, he left Venice, stepping aboard a ship that would take him away from the Adriatic's familiar blue and into the heart of the unknown. It was not a swift voyage. Their journey would last 24 years, half a lifetime, spent moving between continents, across mountains, through deserts and over seas no Venetian had ever named. They traveled by caravan along the ancient road that stretched from the Mediterranean to China, the Silk Road. It was not a single road, but a vast network of paths winding through lands where sand turned to ice and mountains rose higher than clouds. They crossed Anatolia, where Byzantine ruins stood silent among olive trees. They crossed Persia, where winds carried the scent of fire and jasmine. They braved the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where the air grew so thin that even the camels knelt in exhaustion. But each hardship brought them closer to a legend, the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the vast Mongol Empire. To reach him was to reach the edge of the known world. When they arrived, weary and sunburned, they expected to find a savage ruler. Instead, they found a man of intellect and grace. Kublai Khan welcomed them not as strangers, but as guests. He was fascinated by these pale men from a distant city of islands who came bearing stories of a world he had never seen. The Khan's court was like nothing Marco had ever imagined. His palace shone with lacquered wood and silk banners with ivory pillars carved in the shape of dragons. The air was filled with music bells, flutes, and strange stringed instruments that seemed to breathe. Marco, still a boy in years but old in wonder, walked through halls filled with maps of the heavens and scrolls written in languages he could not read. Here was a civilization that rivaled anything the West could conceive. The Mongol emperor's domain stretched from the China Sea to the mountains of Russia. His armies rode on horseback like storms across the plains, and his cities pulsed with trade and invention. Marco proved himself a quick learner. His intelligence and curiosity impressed the Khan, who made him an emissary, a messenger between courts, a Venetian voice in an Asian empire. For 17 years he served under the Great Khan, traveling through lands few Europeans would ever glimpse. He saw the canals and teeming markets of Hangzhou, greater even than Venice in size and splendor. He visited temples of jade and cities that glowed at night with lanterns like fallen stars. He witnessed inventions that would not reach Europe for centuries. Paper money, coal fires that burned hotter than wood, and intricate postal systems that connected the empire like a living network of veins. Everywhere he went, he carried with him the memory of Venice, the reflection of her waters, the echo of her bells, and in every wonder he saw, he also saw her reflection. The bridges of the East reminded him of the Rialto. The bustling harbors recalled the lagoon. The two worlds, East and West, seemed to mirror each other through him. But no journey lasts forever. After nearly a quarter of a century abroad, the Polos longed for home. The Great Khan, now old, reluctantly gave them permission to return. They set out by sea, crossing the South China Sea, sailing around India, and through the Arabian waters that carried the scent of cinnamon and myrrh. Many of their companions died along the way, lost to storms and disease. Yet somehow, against the odds, the Polos survived. When they finally reached Venice in 1295, their clothes were tattered, their faces hardened by time. Their neighbors did not recognize them. Some thought them impostors. Others laughed at their tales of distant empires and cities of light. So to prove who they were, the Polos cut open the seams of their ragged coats, and out spilled jewels, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, hidden in the lining for safekeeping. In that moment, Venice gasped in awe. The lost sons of the Republic had returned, bringing with them the riches and stories of a world beyond the horizon. Yet Marco's story did not end in triumph, but in captivity. A few years after his return, war broke out between Venice and her rival Genoa. Marco, now a seasoned sailor, commanded a galley in the Venetian fleet. In 1298, he was captured in battle and thrown into a Genoese prison. There, behind cold stone walls, he met a writer named Rustichello da Pisa. By candlelight, Marco told him everything: his journeys, his discoveries, his marvels, and the writer recorded them all. The book that resulted. The travels of Marco Polo spread across Europe like wildfire. Some called it the Million Lies, doubting its truth. Others saw in it a revelation, a window into a wider world waiting beyond the horizon. Centuries later, that same book would inspire explorers like Christopher Columbus, who carried it with him across the Atlantic. Through its pages, Venice spoke to the world. Her voice carried far beyond the reach of her sails. Marco Polo had not merely traveled for trade or adventure. He had become a bridge between worlds, a symbol of Venice's spirit, curious, courageous, and unafraid of the unknown. When he died in his beloved city, the lagoon outside his window shimmered as it always had, reflecting both the past and the future. And though centuries have passed since his final voyage, his story remains a compass for all who dream. For Venice, the city of the sea, was never meant to stand still, and neither were her sons. When Marco Polo's voice fell silent, the city of Venice listened to the echo he left behind. His tales of golden empires and faraway lands filled the hearts of his countrymen with wonder, but they also stirred something deeper: pride. Venice had conquered the seas not through violence alone, but through wisdom, patience, and imagination. Yet even the most serene waters can turn turbulent. The same sea that carried Marco Polo to glory would soon carry war to Venice's doorstep. For while the Republic basked in her wealth and fame, a familiar shadow was rising again beyond the western horizon: the rival city of Genoa, the other lion of the sea. For more than a century, Venice and Genoa had mirrored one another like twin stars locked in an endless orbit. Both were born from the sea, both were ruled by merchants rather than kings, and both dreamed of mastering the Mediterranean. They traded in the same ports, courted the same empires, and chased the same winds. But there could never be two masters of one ocean. Sooner or later, the tide would bring them face to face. The year was 1378, when the final and most desperate conflict between these two maritime powers erupted: the War of Chioggia. It began as most wars between merchants do, with trade and pride. Genoa, envious of Venice's dominance in the east, sought to cripple her by cutting the Republic's trade routes. Venetian galleys were harassed, and seized their merchants humiliated. What began as raids soon escalated into open battle. The war swept across the Mediterranean like a spreading fire from the Aegean to the Adriatic. At first, fortune favored the Genoese. Bold and cunning, their admirals struck swiftly where Venice was least prepared. In a daring maneuver that stunned the world, the Genoese fleet sailed straight into the Venetian lagoon, the one place believed to be untouchable. The shallow channels that had protected Venice for 1,000 years now became her prison. The invaders captured the port town of Chioggia, at the southern edge of the lagoon, planting their banners within sight of the city's towers. For the first time in her history, Venice felt the cold breath of danger upon her neck. Panic gripped the city. Bells tolled not for celebration, but for fear. The markets of the Rialto fell silent, their goods abandoned. The arsenal, once alive with the clang of hammers, became a fortress. Citizens gathered in the piazza, whispering prayers as they watched the horizon darken with the sails of their enemies. Food grew scarce. The Genoese blockade cut Venice off from the world. The sea that had always nourished her was now a wall of hunger. But from despair, the Venetians drew courage. Their government, as always, acted not with chaos, but with discipline. Every man who could row, sail, or fight was summoned to the defense of the Republic. Old rivalries among the noble families were set aside, even the Doge himself. Andrea Contarini, though in his 70s, took command of the defense. The Senate ordered new ships built faster and stronger to counter the Genoese threat. In the arsenal, men worked day and night, their torches burning like stars in the smoke. Among those called back to service was a man who had once been disgraced and imprisoned, Admiral Vetter Pisani, the Republic's greatest naval commander. Years earlier, he had been blamed for a defeat and jailed in humiliation. Now, in this darkest hour, the people demanded his return. The Doge freed him, placed a sword in his hands, and entrusted him with the fate of Venice. Pisani accepted without bitterness. "I will serve her," he said simply, "as she has always served me." His strategy was audacious, born of desperation, yet guided by genius. Instead of attacking the Genoese fleet head-on, he would trap them as they had trapped Venice. Moving under the cover of night, he led his ships through secret channels to the southern mouth of the lagoon. There, his men sank old vessels filled with stones, blocking the only escape route for the enemy. When dawn broke, the Genoese fleet found itself imprisoned in the very harbor it had conquered. The hunters had become the hunted. The siege that followed was brutal. For months, both sides endured hunger, sickness, and exhaustion. The winter winds howled across the lagoon, carrying the smell of salt and smoke. The Genoese, cut off from supplies, began to wither. Their proud admirals sent desperate messages for aid that never came. Meanwhile, the Venetians, though weary, were driven by something more powerful than fear, the unshakable belief that their city was eternal. Women and children worked beside the men, repairing ships, weaving ropes, and carrying food to the front lines. Even the clergy joined the fight, their prayers mingling with the cries of the wounded. In June of 1380, after 6 long months of blockade, the end finally came. Starving and surrounded, the Genoese fleet surrendered. Their commander, Pietro Doria, bowed before the Doge, offering his sword. Venice had not only survived, she had triumphed. The victory at Chioggia broke Genoa's naval power forever. The once proud rival of Venice would never again challenge her on the seas. The Lion of St. Mark had roared for the last time against its twin, and the echo carried across the centuries. The celebration that followed was not one of arrogance, but of relief. Bells rang through the city, not in the wild joy of conquest, but in gratitude for deliverance. The people filled St. Mark's Square, where the Doge stood before them, weary yet radiant. He did not speak of revenge or glory. Instead, he knelt before the basilica and offered thanks to God and to the sea, the eternal allies of Venice. That night, the lagoon shimmered under the moonlight. The reflections of the city's lights trembled softly upon the water, as if the sea itself smiled in quiet pride. Venice had faced her greatest trial and emerged stronger than ever. Her empire was safe, her faith renewed, and her people united as one. But victories are never without their shadows. The war had drained the Republic's coffers and cost countless lives. The arsenal was empty, its ships scattered, or broken. Yet from the ruins of battle rose a new age of prosperity. With her rival defeated, Venice stood alone as the undisputed master of Mediterranean trade. The sea belonged to her once more, and from its depths she would draw unimaginable wealth. The tide had turned again in her favor, carrying with it the scent of pepper, cinnamon, and distant lands. The era of merchants, the age of spice and silk, was about to begin. Venice, reborn from fire and salt, would soon reach the height of her golden age, where faith and fortune danced together in the reflection of her waters. The war was over. The Genoese banners had been lowered, their proud ships scattered like leaves across the tide. The lagoon, once filled with the roar of cannons, now reflected only peace. A peace bought dearly with courage and sacrifice. The bells that had once called Venetians to battle now sang of triumph and thanksgiving. The Republic, bloodied but unbroken, had survived her darkest trial. Yet in the calm that followed the storm, a new hunger began to stir. A hunger not for conquest, but for wealth, beauty, and the sweet perfume of distant worlds. Venice, reborn from war, was ready to enter her age of splendor. The city's soul turned once more to the sea. Her ships, repaired and repainted, returned to the waters like swans gliding into the dawn. The arsenal roared back to life, its hammers striking in rhythm as new galleys took shape, not for war this time, but for trade. Across the Mediterranean, her merchants fanned out to rebuild the network that had made Venice the envy of the world. The sea that had once brought her peril now brought her prosperity, and the scent of spices carried on the wind was richer than any song. In those years, the world was growing smaller and brighter. From the ports of Alexandria and Damascus came treasures that seemed touched by paradise: pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, spices so rare that a handful could purchase a horse and a shipload could buy a palace. There was saffron as red as sunset ginger that burned like fire, and sugar that sparkled like captured light. To the Venetians, these were not luxuries but necessities. The currency of dreams, the very breath of their wealth. The journey of these spices was as wondrous as the goods themselves. They were born in the distant islands of the Indies, harvested by unseen hands beneath the equatorial sun, then carried by caravans across deserts and mountains to the markets of Arabia and Egypt. From there, they crossed the Red Sea to Cairo or Alexandria, where Venetian merchants waited with open purses and sharper minds. They paid in silver glassware and fine cloth, exchanging the products of Europe for the treasures of the East. Once loaded aboard their ships, the spices began the long voyage home, guarded by the Lion of St. Mark painted on every sail. When those ships entered the lagoon, the whole city seemed to awaken. Dock workers shouted as sacks were unloaded, their contents filling the air with fragrance. The spice merchants, known as pepperers, recorded every grain in their ledgers, their fingers stained with the dust of faraway lands. Along the quays of the Rialto, prices were whispered, fortunes decided with the flick of a coin. The scent of clove and cinnamon drifted through the air, blending with the salt of the sea and the incense of the basilica. Even the stones of Venice seemed to glow warmer, as if the city itself were perfumed by her own prosperity. With wealth came beauty. The profits of trade built palaces along the Grand Canal, their facades rising like marble dreams from the water. Each family sought to outshine the next, commissioning architects to carve lace from stone painters to capture the shimmer of heaven, and musicians to fill their halls with melody. Venice became a city of art and light, where even the narrowest alley reflected the gold of sunset. Wealth did not merely decorate her, it defined her. The very air felt gilded, but it was not greed that drove her. It was wonder. The Venetians saw themselves as custodians of the world's treasures, guardians of a harmony that joined East and West. Their ships did not conquer, they connected. In their holds, they carried not just spices and silks, but ideas, stories, inventions, philosophies. Through Venice, Europe learned of Arabic astronomy, Chinese porcelain, and the healing herbs of India. Knowledge itself became another kind of spice, traded and savored by the minds of the Republic. The city's merchants walked with quiet dignity, their robes of black silk reflecting both humility and power. They moved through the arcades of the Rialto like priests in a temple of commerce, their conversations soft but decisive. To them, a well-written contract was holier than any sermon, for it kept faith between men and nations. Venice was a republic built on trust, each signature a promise, each voyage a prayer. Yet beneath the serenity of her prosperity, the republic remained watchful. Her navy patrolled the seas, guarding the spice routes from pirates and rivals. The memory of Genoa's siege was still fresh, and the Senate knew that wealth unguarded is merely bait for envy. So they fortified their ports, strengthened their alliances, and turned the sea itself into a shield. The balance between beauty and vigilance became the soul of Venice. In those golden days, life itself felt like a festival. Carnival blossomed into a season of dreams. Masks of gold and ivory concealed the faces of nobles and beggars alike, as if Venice wished to forget for a while who was rich and who was poor. Music drifted from open windows, mingling with laughter and the splash of oars. Gondolas painted black by decree. To restrain vanity became floating shadows that glided beneath bridges of marble. Love and intrigue moved silently through the labyrinth of canals, their stories lost in reflections and moonlight. Art flourished as the truest reflection of the Republic's heart. In the churches, painters captured the divine in colors brighter than dawn. In the workshops, glassmakers of Murano melted sand into jewels of liquid fire. The glow of their furnaces mirrored the glow of the city itself, fragile, luminous, eternal. Venice had become not only the center of trade, but the workshop of the world's beauty. And yet, as wealth poured in like the tide, voices of caution rose within the great council. Some feared that the Republic, drunk on success, might lose the virtues that had built her discipline, humility, unity. Gold is a sweet poison, one senator warned, and even the sea can drown its children. The warning went largely unheeded. The people of Venice believed their city was blessed beyond harm, chosen by God, and guarded by the sea. Each morning as dawn spread its golden light over the lagoon, the city gleamed like a jewel newly polished. The sails of departing ships caught the wind, and their reflections shimmered in the calm water. From the campanile of St. Mark's, the bells called out not to war, but to work, to the quiet heroism of trade and creation. Venice was at her zenith. Her wealth unmatched, her influence woven through every port from Alexandria to London. But beyond the horizon, other empires were stirring. The East was changing, and so was the world. A new power was rising in the Ottoman lands, threatening the fragile web of trade. And far to the west, strange rumors whispered of Portuguese sailors searching for a sea route around Africa, a road that might one day bypass Venice altogether. For now, though, none of that mattered. The Lion of St. Mark slept peacefully beside the sea, his mane touched by the scent of spice and the promise of eternity. Venice, radiant and serene, had reached her golden age. The scent of cinnamon and cloves still lingered over the lagoon. The city had become a treasure chest overflowing with gold and song. Its people believed they had found eternity in the rhythm of trade and the glow of prosperity. But even paradise, when left too long unchanged, begins to yearn for something more solid beneath its feet. Venice, the city born of the sea, had lived for centuries surrounded by water and dreams. Now her gaze turned inland to the land beyond the horizon, where mountains rose like walls and fields shimmered under the Italian sun. The sea had made her rich. The land would now be asked to keep her safe. After the War of Chioggia, the Republic's senators had learned a painful lesson. The sea could be both protector and trap. When the Genoese had invaded Venice, had nearly starved. Her power lay in her ships, but her weakness was hunger. She had no fields, no vineyards, no granaries of her own. Every loaf of bread, every handful of grain, had to cross the water before reaching her people. The Senate, wise and wary, resolved that this could never happen again. If the sea had given her wings, the land must now give her roots. Thus began the Republic's new chapter, the conquest not of waves, but of soil. It was not a conquest of violence or ambition, but of necessity. One by one, the cities of the Venetian mainland, Padua, Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, and Bergamo, were drawn into her embrace. Some came willingly, tired of local feuds and desiring Venice's order and wealth. Others resisted and were subdued not by brute force, but by the quiet, methodical patience that had always defined the Republic. Where other powers raised armies, Venice raised treaties. Where others built walls, she built alliances. Her soldiers fought when they must, but her greatest weapon was her reputation for fairness. The land Venetians came to rule was rich and green, threaded with rivers, and crowned with gentle hills. It became known as the Stato da Terra, the state of the land, to match her Stato da Mar, the empire of the sea. Together, they formed a perfect balance, the land feeding the sea protecting the land. The lagoon, once a fragile refuge, was now the beating heart of a vast and intricate body. Wheat from the plains of Lombardy filled her storerooms, timber from the forests of Cadore strengthened her ships, and stone from the quarries of Istria built her palaces. Venice had at last found a way to stand upon two worlds, but the expansion brought new challenges not of the sea's kind, swift and merciless, but slow and human. The cities of the mainland had their own customs, their own pride. Many resented being ruled by a distant city that floated on water. They could not understand Venice's strange, disciplined government, where no man could call himself king, and every decision was weighed like gold on a scale. To the proud citizens of Verona or Padua, submission to Venice felt like surrendering to a ghost. And yet over time the ghost proved kinder than any lord of flesh. Venetian rule, though firm, was fair. Taxes were predictable, laws were clear, and corruption, while not absent, was punished with merciless precision. The mainland grew prosperous under this calm hand. Canals were built to link rivers to lagoons, carrying barges laden with grain, wine, and silk. New markets blossomed where the voices of peasants and merchants mingled in harmony. Venetian engineers, masters of water and geometry, transformed the landscape into a living map of commerce. Cities that had once feared her came to depend on her. Farmers blessed the Lion of St. Mark painted on granary doors, knowing that its shadow meant stability. The Republic, which had once been a cluster of islands trembling before barbarian storms, had become a vast organism, half earth, half sea. Yet this expansion also changed her soul. The old simplicity of the lagoon, the humility of a people born from exile, began to fade beneath layers of wealth and power. In the Great Council, some nobles whispered that Venice was becoming too worldly, too proud. They worried that by stepping onto land, the Republic was stepping away from her destiny. But others argued that this was her natural evolution. The sea gave us birth, one senator declared, but the land will give us life. The debate echoed through the marble halls of the Doge's palace, as endless and fluid as the tides that lapped against its foundations. The Republic's armies, though small compared to the monarchies of Europe, became legendary for their skill. Venice hired professional captains known as condottieri, men of fortune who fought not for faith or country, but for gold. They were soldiers as elegant as they were deadly, adorned with plumes and armor that glinted in the sun. Among them were names that would be whispered across Italy for generations: Francesco Busoni da Carmagnola, Bartolomeo Colleoni, Erasmo da Narni, known as Gatta Melata. These men fought Venice's wars and sometimes betrayed her, for loyalty to gold is loyalty to nothing. Still, Venice knew how to turn even treachery to her advantage. She kept her generals close, rewarding them richly, but watching them closer still. When a condottiere grew too ambitious, the Council of Ten, the secret guardians of the state, would act with cold efficiency. Such was the fate of Carmagnola, the great commander who once won victories for the Republic, but later hesitated to strike its enemies. The Senate, suspecting betrayal, summoned him back to Venice under the pretense of honor. There, in the courtyard between the Doge's palace and the prisons, he was arrested, tried in silence, and beheaded at dawn. The city that trusted no kings would trust no heroes either. It was this discipline, as cruel as it was brilliant, that preserved her. While other Italian states were torn by the passions of princes and dynasties, Venice remained serene. She was governed not by men, but by method. Even in the face of intrigue and rebellion, her marble facade did not crack. The same patience that once allowed her to build upon mud now allowed her to build upon power. By the close of the 15th century, the Republic's dominion stretched from the Alps to the sea, from the shores of Istria to the banks of the Po. Her fleet ruled the Mediterranean. Her markets set the price of gold and grain. Travelers who entered her lands often said that the air itself smelled of order. The roads were safe, the towns clean, the people well fed. To the outside world, Venice seemed eternal, a miracle of reason in an age of turmoil. Yet beneath that calm, a quiet tension remained. The sea and the land had joined hands, but they did not always understand each other. The merchants of the lagoon still dreamed of faraway trade winds, while the farmers of the mainland longed for the stability of soil. The Republic had become a bridge between two worlds, and every bridge, no matter how strong, must one day bear a heavy crossing. For now, though, the balance held. The Lion of St. Mark, carved in marble and bronze across 100 cities, watched over both water and earth with the same steady gaze. The sea still whispered to Venice in the language of tides, and the land answered with the hum of harvest. The Republic had learned to walk where once she had only floated. But soon, the very ambition that gave her strength would test the foundations of her faith. The story of her glory was not yet done, but the shadows of her decline were already forming beneath the golden light. The Lion of St. Mark stood proudly over two worlds, now sea and land, spirit and empire. The Republic had learned to balance water and soil, wealth and order, faith and ambition. Her ships carried the treasures of the East, her fields yielded the fruits of the West, and her people believed themselves chosen by God to live between heaven and reflection. Yet, as the 15th century deepened, another transformation began, softer, but no less profound. From the quiet power of government and the discipline of war emerged a new Venice, one wrapped not in armor, but in silk, not built upon conquest, but upon illusion. The city of merchants and admirals was becoming the city of masks. When night descended upon the lagoon, the marble walls of the palaces glowed with torchlight. Music floated across the canals carried by the wind and the slow rhythm of oars. The air smelled of roses and wine mingled with salt and candle wax. Behind closed doors, nobles hosted banquets that lasted until dawn, their laughter echoing against ceilings painted with angels. In the piazzas, jugglers, poets, and dancers performed beneath the watchful gaze of saints carved in stone. It was as though the city itself had decided to forget the weight of its victories and dress its memories in gold. Out of this longing for beauty and disguise grew the Venetian Carnival, the grandest and most mysterious celebration in all of Europe. What began as a humble festival before Lent evolved into a season where time itself seemed to dissolve. For weeks, every street became a stage, every passerby an actor. Men and women from every corner of the Republic, nobles, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, moved side by side, their faces hidden behind masks of porcelain and lace. Beneath the anonymity of costume, all were equal. Pride melted, and for a brief moment Venice remembered her earliest truth, that she had been born from exile, from a people who sought safety beyond the reach of judgment. The masks were more than decoration. They were the soul of the city made visible. The bauta, white and expressionless, with its sharp jaw and hollow eyes, became the emblem of the Republic's restraint, a face that revealed nothing, neither fear nor desire. The moretta worn by women was small and dark, held in place by the lips alone, forcing silence and mystery. The colombina, half-mask of elegance and flirtation, adorned with feathers and gold, danced through the alleys like a secret half-spoken. Each mask told a story of freedom and deception, of faith and temptation. And Venice, the greatest storyteller of them all, listened to her own heart beneath the disguise. At night, The gondolas glided silently through the water, like shadows carrying whispers. Lanterns swayed from their prows, casting ripples of gold upon the black surface. Lovers met beneath bridges, their reflections touching before their hands did. The soft pluck of a mandolin drifted from a balcony, and the sea, ancient and eternal, rocked the city gently as though in approval. To walk through Venice in those nights was to walk through a dream that knew it was dreaming. Yet behind the splendor and romance, something else was stirring, a quiet melancholy, a hunger for meaning hidden behind laughter. The Republic was growing old, though her face remained beautiful. Wealth had softened her spirit. The discipline that had once defined her was giving way to pleasure. Her nobles, descendants of sailors and warriors, now spent their days in leisure, their fortunes resting on the shoulders of merchants and bankers. The Senate still met. The Doge still ruled. But the old fire had dimmed. Venice was no longer fighting for survival. She was dancing to forget that one day she might have to. The masks which once symbolized freedom became also a kind of protection from the truth, from the slow decay that crept like mist into her foundations. The city's canals, once alive with the sounds of commerce and command, grew quieter. The arsenal still built ships, but they were fewer now. The cries of sailors were replaced by the laughter of courtesans and the poetry of serenades. Venice was turning inward, retreating into art music and the theater of her own magnificence. Still, even in decline, she was unrivaled. Visitors from France, Spain, and the German lands arrived to marvel at her beauty. Diplomats praised her justice. Poets called her the bride of the sea. The philosopher Erasmus described her as a miracle of human reason, and even kings treated her ambassadors with deference. From afar, she appeared untouched by time. The sunlight still shimmered on her domes. The bells of St. Mark still marked the hours with serenity. But those who listened closely could hear a faint weariness beneath the music, like the sigh of a wave that knows it has traveled too far from shore. In the midst of this gilded calm, Venice remained loyal to her rituals. Each year the Doge still sailed on the Bucintoro to renew the marriage with the sea, casting a ring into the waves as his predecessors had done for centuries. The people cheered, the choirs sang, and the waters sparkled beneath the sun. Yet even this act, once sacred and fierce, had become a pageant, beautiful but hollow, a gesture repeated more from memory than conviction. The marriage still stood, but love had grown polite. And yet the soul of Venice was not lost. It merely changed its expression. It spoke now through the hands of artists and the hearts of dreamers. Painters filled the churches with color and light, capturing not only saints and miracles, but the living glow of the lagoon itself. Musicians filled the air with sound so pure that even the waves seemed to pause and listen. One of them, a priest named Antonio Vivaldi, would later compose melodies that echoed like tides through the centuries, his violin singing of seasons of rain and rebirth, of the eternal rhythm between silence and sound. So Venice transformed once again, as she had always done. From fear to freedom, from power to poetry. The city of warriors had become the city of masks, the theater of the world where truth and illusion danced together like reflections on the water. And though the world beyond her canals was changing, though empires rose and fell, and new routes were being sought to distant lands, Venice chose to remain what she had always been, a dream afloat upon the sea. But dreams, no matter how radiant, cannot last forever. Beyond the horizon, new sails were appearing. Portuguese ships rounding Africa, Spanish ships crossing the Atlantic. The age of discovery was dawning, and for the first time the sea that had made Venice great would begin to drift away from her. The spices she once monopolized would find new paths, and her golden mirrors would reflect not growth but memory. Yet even then she would remain what she had always been, a reflection of humanity itself, proud, fragile, and endlessly beautiful. For now, however, the city slept beneath her 1,000 lights. The bells of midnight echoed across the lagoon, and the masked revelers, tired of laughter, vanished into the fog. The gondolas drifted homeward, their lanterns dimming one by one. Venice, the eternal bride, rested her head upon the shoulder of the sea, and the sea, faithful as ever, sang her softly to sleep. The night of carnival had ended, leaving behind the faint perfume of roses and candle wax drifting over the lagoon. The music had quieted, the masks had vanished, and the first pale light of dawn revealed what the darkness had hidden, the delicate cracks beneath the beauty. Venice still shimmered like a jewel, but her glow was now that of twilight, not morning. Her palaces leaned a little more heavily on their foundations. Her canals whispered more softly, and her people, though proud as ever, had begun to feel what their ancestors never had: the weight of time. The 16th century had opened the world in ways no Venetian could have foreseen. Far to the west, Spain and Portugal had discovered new oceans, new lands, and new routes that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. Once every spice, every silk, every treasure of the East had passed through the lagoon. Now they sailed around Africa, carried by winds that Venice could not command. The world's trade routes had shifted like the currents of a receding tide, and the city that had built her greatness on the mastery of water found herself surrounded by it, yet powerless to steer. At first, the change was invisible like a distant storm. The merchants still met beneath the arches of the Rialto, the Senate still convened in the Doge's palace, and the galleys still left the arsenal gleaming with fresh paint. But the profits grew thinner, the ships fewer. The spice markets no longer sang with the same noise, and the silks from the east lost their monopoly to Lisbon and Seville. The sea that had once brought her life now carried her rivals' flags. Venice was not yet defeated, but she was being forgotten. Still, she resisted. The Republic did not crumble like a careless kingdom. She faded with dignity. Her diplomats moved like chess players across the courts of Europe, balancing alliances, avoiding wars. Her fleets turned north and west, seeking new markets, new trades. Wool from Flanders, metals from Germany, glass from Murano that no one else could rival. And when trade could not sustain her, she turned once more to the art of survival that had always been her gift: beauty. Art became her final empire. The wealth of centuries poured into paint and marble. Titian covered her churches with light. Tintoretto filled them with motion and fire. The walls of the Doge's palace glittered with scenes of victories long past, as if the Republic could paint herself into immortality. The faces of the senators of Doges and saints looked down from those canvases with serene confidence, unaware that the world beyond their walls was changing faster than they could imagine. Even as her trade declined, Venice remained the envy of Europe. Kings and princes sent their envoys to marvel at her stability, her freedom, her quiet power, while the rest of Italy tore itself apart with wars and dynasties. Venice endured. She had no king, no heir, no civil war. Her government complex, ancient and balanced, held like the geometry of a bridge built across centuries. The world called her La Serenissima, the most serene republic. But serenity can hide sorrow. Beneath the surface, fear was growing. The fear that no system, no ritual, no mask could stop the tide that was coming. The Ottoman Empire, strong and relentless, advanced across the eastern Mediterranean. One by one, Venice's colonies and ports fell, Negroponte, Cyprus, Crete. Each loss was a wound, each treaty a bandage that could not heal. The Lion of St. Mark still roared, but his voice grew weaker. The Republic fought bravely, her admirals commanding fleets of valor unmatched, but the balance of power had shifted. Gunpowder and empire had replaced trade and diplomacy. The world no longer belonged to merchants. It belonged to kings. And yet, even in adversity, Venice retained her grace. Her people did not despair. They filled their days with art, music, and ceremony, as though to defy the march of time. Every evening when the sun set over the lagoon, the city glowed in gold and crimson. The bells of St. Mark's rang not as a call to arms, but as a hymn to endurance. Tourists and poets from across Europe came to see her, describing her as a living dream, half real, half reflection. "She is the bride of the sea," one French traveler wrote, "and she grows lovelier as she dies." In the 17th and 18th centuries, Venice became a sanctuary for the spirit. Her theaters filled with laughter, her music with longing. Vivaldi's violins sang of seasons that changed, yet always returned, of renewal amid decay. Her writers spoke of love and melancholy. Her painters turned to shadows and light. Even as her power waned, her imagination deepened. The city became a mirror for the human soul, fragile, brilliant, and aware of its own mortality. But history, like the tide, cannot be resisted forever. The great powers of Europe, France, Austria, Spain, grew restless. The age of republics was ending, and monarchies hungered for every inch of land. Venice, neutral and proud, stood like an island of independence in a continent of empires. Her neutrality, once her shield, became her isolation. She no longer had allies, only memories. Then, in 1797, the inevitable came, not as a storm, but as a silence. Napoleon Bonaparte, young and ambitious, marched through northern Italy like a whirlwind. City after city fell before his armies. Venice, old and unarmed, watched from behind her lagoons, hoping that the waters that had once saved her would protect her again. But this time there was no refuge. The Republic had no army, no fleet strong enough to resist. The Senate debated. The Doge hesitated. And so, without a single cannon fired in her defense, the 1,000-year-old Republic of Venice surrendered. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, laid down his crown before the French general and wept. The Great Council, which had met for centuries to govern the most stable state in Europe, voted its own dissolution. The banners of the lion were lowered from the palaces, replaced by foreign flags. The bells of St. Mark's did not ring that day. The city that had once ruled the seas had fallen not in battle, but in exhaustion. Yet even in defeat, Venice did not truly die. Her people remained. Her churches stood, her canals still reflected the sky. The sea that had birthed her did not abandon her. It simply held her more gently, as though in mourning. The empire was gone, but the dream endured. Travelers who came to see the fallen queen found her as radiant as ever. The light on her waters had not dimmed. It had deepened, tinged with sorrow and wisdom. Centuries have passed since that quiet surrender, but Venice endures as only dreams do. She no longer rules empires, yet she still rules the imagination. Her story is not one of conquest, but of survival. The tale of a people who built eternity upon the fragile surface of water. The tides still rise and fall beneath her. The pigeons still gather in St. Mark's Square, and when the wind carries the scent of salt and bells through the air, it feels as though time itself pauses to listen. Venice lives on not in power, but in beauty, in memory, in reflection. She is a lesson carved in marble and echoed in waves that all glory fades, but grace remains. And as the sun sets over the lagoon, turning the city to liquid gold, one can almost hear her whisper to the sea that shaped her, "I am still yours."